it's Alabama Annie, and welcome to episode 22 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. I really began to wonder about Aunt Mary and her friends that summer. They seemed to have a lot of secrets, and I knew more than my share of them. Because as we'd be riding along in Patsy's car or lazing in the sun by the water on summer days, they'd talk, forgetting that I was even there sometimes after a few drinks. And I heard things that would curl your hair, things I could never tell Miss Hattie. Hattie always said gossip was the hobgoblin of little minds, but it was hard not to listen. One morning at the river while we were swimming, I found out that one of the girls at church had had a baby with the postman. Of course, her mama claimed the baby boy was hers, but everyone noticed how she'd packed Debbie off to her cousins in Mississippi for the summer. "Did you happen to notice how big Debbie's breasts were when she came home?" Myra had said, and Aunt Mary chimed in that it was awfully peculiar that her mother claimed she'd had that baby when he looks just like Wally. And I heard Wally, the postman, got transferred to a route near Cedar Bluff. I thought back to last summer when Debbie announced she was going to Mississippi to visit her cousin, and she didn't even finish out the school year. She just took off, and now I understood why. And Patsy would talk about Doc's patients, never mind a Hippocratic oath or hypocritical oath. She let slip that one of Carl's friends had caught something she called the clap from a woman over in Georgia and had to take lots of penicillin to get rid of it. And she talked about Clara Pike, a member of the women's club. She said she didn't have a kidney infection. Henry punched her in the gut again and broke a rib and bruised her kidney. Myra had a few choice words to say about that. How long is she going to put up with that kind of abuse? Shouldn't somebody do something about him, Aunt Mary had asked, as we rode along in silence. Then Patsy said, "Maybe somebody should." And she and Myra exchanged a look, and I saw that look pass between them. One day, not too long after, I overheard that conversation at breakfast. Miss Hattie was talking to John, and she asked him if he'd heard about Henry Pike, and he said he hadn't. "He's dead," she told him. And he asked her what on earth had happened to him. "Well, they don't know. All I heard is that they found him out behind his barn. Leonard Payne said it looked as though he might have fallen and hit his head on something." I thought back to that day in the car when the Hats had been talking about how he'd punched his wife in the gut again and something ought to be done about it. Another thing I overheard that caused me to wonder what they'd meant by saying somebody should do something was when Myra was talking with Aunt Mary one day in her office here at the tavern, and I was busy dusting the parlor and the rooms along the hall. "You know, Carl won't stand up for himself, but he said he lost lots of money, fair and square, on some bet he'd made to Bill Killian, and I'm not going to put up with that. I want to get our money back," she announced. I moved into the room across the hall from the office so I could hear a little better. I could see Aunt Mary through the door. She stood up and put her hands on her hips. "Then, by golly, we'll do something about that," she said. "We'll go down there to Killian's and we'll get his money back." Not a day or two later at breakfast, Harvey, Uncle John, and Hattie were talking when I came into the kitchen again, and I sat down and drank some of my orange juice. "Nobody knows who shot him," Uncle John said. "Doc's with him now." Miss Hattie brought my plate and set it down in front of me, shaking her head. "Ain't nothing good ever happened down at Killian's," she reminded him. "All that gambling and drinking and carrying on, why, it serves him right he got robbed. And you know half of those old white devils down there are the Klan," she announced. And I thought to myself, it just couldn't have been Aunt Mary and the Hats who did it. But I knew what I'd heard. Aunt Mary say. It was as clear as a bell that day when I'd been cleaning. I didn't put anything past them any longer. A few years later, when Patsy's husband Doc turned up dead in a car crash on the mountain pass, I knew they'd had a hand in that too. And I began to wonder then about Uncle Robert, how he had died. One thing was for sure, I never looked at any of them the same way. It was the day before the big 4th of July celebration when Doc died, and Patsy had an appointment at Julie's hair salon down in Sequoia. She'd wanted him to drive her so that he could get a haircut too, but he was right where he always was during baseball season. He was sitting in his old Olds Cutlass in the driveway, in the driver's seat with a stiff highball and a cigar. He had the ignition switch on and he was listening to the ball game. Patsy went out the back door and had to yell at him over the game to get his attention, asking if he would drive her down to Julie's, telling him that he needed a little trim himself, but he said that the highball was his second one of the day and he wasn't going anywhere until that game was over. Patsy put her hands on her hips and said, "Well, if you change your mind, you'll have to go with me because you know your car needs brakes." He glanced up at her. "I thought Eddie came by and fixed them while we were gone to Florida," he said, but Patsy only shook her head. "Nope, he never got to it," she told him, shrugging, saying she had put more brake fluid in herself when she and Myra had driven it down to the produce stand, but what she didn't really recall was that she hadn't put any fluid in lately, and that cylinder was bone dry. The bottle of brake fluid had been emptied and tossed into the back of the trunk of the car. Patsy dressed and drove herself down to Julie's. She picked up Aunt Mary and they took off for their appointment. Mary turned to Patsy. "Thought you said Doc was coming along for a trim on the back of his hair." "No, the Braves are playing," she said as Aunt Mary waved to me and shut the door before they drove away. Then it must have been 30 minutes later that Doc finished his second drink and glanced into the rearview mirror of the Olds. He realized Patsy had been right. He was looking a little scruffy around the neck and ears, and he did need a trim after all. I was playing out front of the tavern, picking 4-leaf clovers to make a chain from them when I saw Doc come driving past. The reason I noticed him was that his car was making a squealing sound as he came to a stop at the light, and I turned to look. He waved at me as he drove down the pass, and it wasn't but a minute or so later when I heard the sound of a car skidding and the crash and bang of an accident. I got a sick feeling in my stomach, and I knew it was Doc. So I ran back inside the tavern and was out of breath by the time I skidded into the kitchen. "Miss Hattie," I cried, "call the sheriff. I think Doc just had a wreck on the mountain." She jumped up from the table and hurried to the telephone and dialed Leonard Payne. Before too long, Leonard came rolling past in the patrol car, followed by Mr. Harvey driving the fire truck, and Uncle John raced off in his truck too. In just a little while, Uncle John came back up, and we learned that Doc had crashed in the curve. He'd gone off the road and down the mountainside into a big tree. The car had caught fire, and Doc was dead. Leonard asked us if we knew where Patsy might be, and I told him she and Aunt Mary and Myra were at the hair salon. "Somebody has to tell her," Miss Hattie said. So we climbed in with Leonard and drove down past the wreck and the fire truck to Julie's hair salon. Patsy and Aunt Mary were sitting under the big hair dryers when we arrived, and Myra was having her nails done. Leonard and Miss Hattie moved over to tell Julie, who stopped painting Myra's nails. Myra gasped when she heard the bad news. Julie shut off the dryers and stood close by as Leonard told Patsy exactly what had happened. She collapsed in Aunt Mary's arms. She was inconsolable. "Poor old thing probably changed his mind about that haircut," she'd sobbed as Leonard knelt down and handed her his handkerchief. "Doc's brakes failed, Patsy. He skidded several hundred feet before he crashed. Do you know if the brakes were all right?" Patsy only shook her head. "Eddie was supposed to have come to fix the car while Doc was on vacation, but he never did, and I put some brake fluid in, but that was a while back. Miss Hattie and Aunt Mary brought Patsy to the tavern and got her settled in Aunt Mary's room for a while. I was out in the hall when I heard my aunt tell Patsy not to worry about anything. What's done is done, sweetie. Now don't you worry. Myra and I will see to it all, she assured her. That left me to wonder if Patsy had even told Doc the brakes hadn't been fixed on the car. I knew Patsy hadn't been happy with him for some time. She was always complaining to the Hats that he was cheating on her and gambling away all their money every chance he got. And then look what happened at Killian's. Now all three of the Hats were widowed except for Myra, and I kept thinking about Carl. I wondered how long it would be before something happened to him as well. I really wanted to tell somebody, but who would have believed me?